Before, however, we get into it, I just want to give a bit of recognition. There is a group of Coloradans that work together, putting on programs like this and otherwise spreading information on Article 5. They're called the First Committee of Correspondence of Colorado. And they did a lot of work to put this together. Could the members of the First Committee please stand and be acknowledged? I want to welcome you all to the latest installment in a very long and successful tradition whereby Americans have cured problems, dysfunctions with the political system through constitutional amendment. The founders had a number of reasons for putting the provision for constitutional amendment in the Constitution. The original constitutions of most of the states did not have provisions for amendments, but the founders wanted our Constitution to last for centuries. And so they knew that there had to be some kind of mechanism for change, sometimes for change conditions, sometimes maybe if the government grew dysfunctional or abusive, as unlikely as that scenario would be. And so the founding generation themselves began the process almost immediately after the adoption of the Constitution by the enactment of the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, and not too many people know this, the Bill of Rights got through Congress in large part, maybe only because several states, including Virginia and New York, threatened to hold an amendments convention unless Congress produced the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was ratified, stood essentially undamaged for 150 years. And while large parts of it have been damaged, it still serves as an important bulwark for liberty. When a government spies on the millions of people it is supposed to serve, many people legitimately draw the conclusion that maybe it's time to bolster up that Bill of Rights somewhat. But bolstering up that Bill of Rights in the form of a constitutional amendment is something that Congress is never going to propose because it involves limiting Congress's own power. And since the adoption of the Bill of Rights, Congress hasn't done that. And so that's one of the arguments for a convention of states as a way of amending the Constitution without Congress as the founders envisioned. About 60 years ago, Americans drew the conclusion that it was probably a bad idea to enable the President of the United States to be reelected and reelected and reelected again until he died in office. And so Americans adopted the 22nd Amendment, which imposed a 2-term limit on the president. And that's held ever since. That cured that particular problem. We have a situation today where I'm told there is less turnover in the House of Representatives than there is in the British House of Lords. And so some people have reached the reasonable conclusion that maybe we need term limits, just like we imposed on the president 60 years ago. But I'll give you a hint. Congress is not going to propose that, which is one of the reasons why we need a convention of states. It's not just Congress that can become abusive. The United States Supreme Court, and this may surprise you, can also exceed its powers. This has become famous in the modern world, but it's not just a modern development. Only a few years after the Constitution was adopted, the Supreme Court decided a case called Chisholm versus Georgia, in which it significantly increased its own jurisdiction beyond the level that was intended by the framers of the Constitution. The founding generation acted quickly. Within a year, they proposed and they adopted the 11th Amendment, which restricted back the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The 11th Amendment is fully effective today and fully respected. And that's not the only example where amendments have been passed to overrule or rein in the United States Supreme Court. The first sentence of the 14th Amendment was designed to reverse an erroneous Supreme Court decision. And the 26th Amendment was passed in order to bring some clarity to a truly chaotic opinion that the U.S. Supreme Court issued in 1970 called Oregon versus Mitchell. It's not just the, so some people would argue that maybe we need amendments to restrict what the Supreme Court does, or maybe we need term limits on the Supreme Court. The problem is many of the Supreme Court's abuse of powers actually benefit Congress. There have been proposals in Congress to try to rein in the Supreme Court somewhat. They've always gotten nowhere. And that's one of the reasons, at least I believe, we need a convention of states. It's not just the federal government that can become abusive. Few people know this today, but in the 19th century, many of the states got into overspending their budgets. They ran large deficits, and they spent enormous amounts of money on infrastructure projects like canals. As a result of this, many states got into serious financial difficulty. And actually, several states effectively declared bankruptcy. As a result of that hard experience, Americans in 49 states adopted financial restrictions on what their state legislatures could do. They adopted balanced budget amendments, and they also adopted debt limitation amendments. And while those amendments don't always work perfectly, I've never met anyone who says that we would be better off without them. And they generally have prevented states from moving into bankruptcy. Some people would argue that the situation that existed in the 19th century for the states exists for the United States government today. That we simply cannot go on overspending and encumbering our children and our grandchildren, and in fact ourselves, with debts owed to people like the Chinese. That it's time to pass fiscal restraints on Congress. But the hard fact is Congress has had 30, 40 years to pass fiscal restraints on itself and has always declined to do so. That's one reason I believe we need a convention of states.